Republican instead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey, folks, and welcome back to the Enemies List podcast. I am your host, as always, Rick Wilson. I am joined today by the amazing Timothy Snyder. He is the Richard Levin Professor of History and Global Affairs at Yale. He's the author of books that if you haven't read by now, you ought to have read, including On Tyranny. He's got a phenomenal new book that is the countervailing element to On Tyranny, and that book is On Freedom. I cannot recommend this highly enough to you, especially in the moment that we are in this country, where one political party is, at least to put it mildly, tyranny curious, and where another seems to be a little bit hapless in its defense. So with that, Timothy Snyder, I want to welcome you to the program. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm going to ask you the question that I always ask folks. What was it that led you to write this book at this moment?
I wish I had a snappy answer for that, Rick, because the truth is that, like, I have a snappy answer for On Tyranny, right? On Tyranny, I wrote in a few days at the end of 2016 after Trump got elected, because I was in the middle of a larger book about Russian anti-democratic campaigns in the world and the rise of neo-fascism. And I was in the middle of a career writing about political atrocity. And so this thing happened in my own country. And because of the other trajectories I was on, I could react very quickly and write that pamphlet. Whereas with On Freedom, it's more like, if I write about terrible things, then I should be able to write about good things. And if I write about playing defense, I should also be able to write about creativity and what a better America would look like. And so On Freedom, as you said at the very beginning, is kind of my own response to On Tyranny, but it's not the kind of thing you can do in a moment. Like On Tyranny, I did in the moment. On Freedom took me the better part. It took me about 5 years to do On Freedom. It took me a long time. Creation is hard.
No question about that. So Americans have uniquely always had a sense that they are of the most free nations. They have always had a sense that they are sui generis when it comes to freedom, that other countries don't have our long history of liberty, as flawed as it may be. Does America today look more like other countries in the world now because we are flirting with a more autocratic model of governance, a more autocratic model of leadership? Do you think Americans realize what's at stake? I guess is the real question I'm getting to. That they're for the sugar rush of Trumpism and authoritarianism, they're willing to give up this 250-year history.
Yeah, or at least a 250-year tradition of imagining that things could get better. There are a couple of ways of thinking about the Constitution. At least one of them is that the Constitution and the Declaration contain aspirations for human freedom or for a kind of American society towards which we should be constantly striving. But another interpretation of the Constitution is that it's full of black holes, and it's full of punctuation marks, and it's full of things where you can hang other people. It's full of places where you can find an exit route into some kind of tyrannical system, which is how a lot of people read it, unfortunately, including the majority of the Supreme Court, I'm afraid. So, going back to I think the two parts of your question are just intimately linked. The danger is that Americans think that whatever they do, it must be democratic and freedom, we have this language of narcissism where we kind of forgive ourselves for everything in advance, right? No matter what we do, it must be freedom because we're Americans. And that kind of circular logic just propels you in one direction, and that's towards tyranny, because then whatever you do, whatever mistake you make, you immediately forgive yourself. You immediately say, well, that must have been okay because we did it and we're Americans and we're exceptional. So that's all obviously a big trap. And my life and my career instructs me that if you're not making comparisons either to a better America or, as you say, to other countries, then you're not being a patriot, you're being a nationalist. And if you're being a nationalist, you're going to end up driving your country towards precisely an authoritarian system.
Mm-hmm. So you write a little section in the book that's really struck me, and it was called sado-populism. Mm-hmm. And it was about the emergence. It wasn't even it was just a part of one of your chapters, and it was about the emergence of this idea in America that you not only have to be right and win on an issue, you have to punish the other side for what they believed. Talk to us a little bit about where you see that emerging, and how that fits in with the longer anti-freedom movement in the world.
That's a really wonderful question, because it gets down to the things which are, in a way below the Constitution. It gets down to the way you actually think about what human society should be like and what the future ought to be like. So one way of thinking about freedom would be to say, I'm free if you're free, and we're all free if we can all see a future which is open and towards which we can strive with our various value commitments, our various ideals, our various paths. Another way to look at freedom is to say, I feel free if I can watch you suffer. And that is unfortunately a very, very strong tradition. It's not just a hypothetical, it's a tradition. Like, I'm free if I own slaves. I'm free if I control women. I'm free if I can actually control the world around me. And so there's a price to my freedom, which is that other people can't be free, and that's just the way things are. And the afterlife of that is this sado-populism, right? Like the sort of this kind of sad desire to be a plantation owner, even though you're not a plantation owner, or your sense that, like, I'm free if I can watch other people suffer. And in America, this has, like, you see this in the racism that people don't usually want to make explicit, and you see it also in the own the libs thing, which people do want to make explicit, right? Like, I'm happy because Trump is owning the libs, but what Trump is actually doing is he's making government less functional. So I'm going to suffer, but I'm going to enjoy watching you suffer more. And that's going to be my notion. That's going to be my notion of freedom. And of course, that's not freedom at all. That's just like, that's, as you say, like, that's a kind of like junk food. Like, that's an addiction. That's something you get into. But at the end of that, everybody is much worse off, including the people who talk about owning the libs.
What are the elements of freedom that you think are most at risk in America today, that we need to defend most zealously right now in this country? You talk some about it in the book. But I don't think folks think about it in sufficiently explicit terms. There's a sort of amorphous, like, they're authoritarians, they're bad people, they're going to do bad things. What are some of the freedoms you see that most at risk right now?
This gets back to one of your earlier questions, which I didn't quite hit adequately. So number one, I think we have to actually think about what freedom is. Like, so before we get to what are the aspects of it, like, what is it honestly? I think we abuse this word in American English. We use it all the time. We stretch it out. And what we often mean, even like, and this isn't just a right-wing problem, this goes deep into the center and even often into the left, or especially the far left. We imagine that we'll be free when we get all the barriers out of the way. And, right. and of course, like, barriers are bad. Like, I don't want barriers in my way. But the real question is, who am I and what am I doing? Like, it's a barrier to me. The problem is not the prison wall. The problem is the person behind the prison wall. It's not the barbed wire. It's the people behind the barbed wire and what they could become if that barbed wire weren't there. But we get stuck on the negative part. And so we get stuck on the notion that government's the problem. And, sometimes government is a problem, and sometimes it's not, and so the whole point in thinking about freedom is to think, okay, how could we design a government that creates the conditions for freedom? Because the cheap, easy step that a lot of folks want to take, and it's kind of a mental trap, is to say, oh, let's just burn it all down and then we'll be free. But if we burn it all down, we're not going to be free. Right? If we burn it all down, Elon Musk is going to be in charge. If we burn it all down, it's going to be a competition of the oligarchs for the scrap that remains. That's what it's going to be. And a big part of the upcoming Trump administration seems designed around that. So that's the basic thing for me. And then the second thing I wanted to say goes back to your earlier question. I think in terms of thinking about freedom, this is where you said the thing about tyranny curious. Like, in terms of thinking about freedom, what we miss is how depressing and distressing it ends up being in your daily life if you're not free. Like people think I'm going to enjoy watching other people suffer. I'm going to enjoy owning the libs, and which a logic which leads, by the way, to I'm going to enjoy watching them hang from the lampposts. That's where it
Yes,
eventually
correct.
leads you to. I'm going to enjoy that, But what people miss is the depressing part. Like you're not going to enjoy being denounced by your neighbors, and you're not going to enjoy denouncing your neighbors. Probably you're not going to enjoy all the fights in your kids' schools. You're not going to enjoy the idea that if your kid steps out of line, the kid is going to be denied higher education. You're not going to enjoy all that tedious, everyday tyrannical stuff. I think Americans have a kind of Hollywood view of tyranny, like there's a strong man, and that strong man comes and solves your problems, and he's going to be your strong man. But he's not going to be your strong man. He's not going to solve your problems, and he's going to make your life sad. He's going to make your life tedious. He's going to make your life depressing. That's the part which I think Americans really don't get.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because I remember having a conversation with an East German military officer back right after the wall came down, and he said, I was a young guy working for the Defense Department, and I remember asking him, what was the worst part of this whole thing? I mean, I know the oppression, and I was in my 20s, so I thought it must be like they must have thought about the horrible boot of communism on their throat. And he goes, no, it was just all the culture, of you knew you were always watched, you knew you were being snitched on. And he says, and you look out to the west, and you see the lights in Berlin every night, and you're like, that's a world where they're free. That's a world where they're free. And it was a world that was vivid and interesting, and that's the most corrosive thing for oppressive regimes, is the presence of non-oppressive regimes. I think that that Americans are undercounting just how boring it is to live in North Korea. Even though Donald Trump loves that Kim Jong-un makes his people all stand up and salute for him, tyranny is dull. It's a grinding thing. I guess it's fundamentally sort of counteract or countervailing to human nature. They're just not. It's dull because it has to be. It grinds people down because it has to, but it doesn't make it a fulfilling life for anybody.
Yeah, I love that. I'm gonna meet your anecdote with an anecdote,
Okay.
which is important to me. I was one of my two doctoral supervisors was a very distinguished Polish intellectual historian called Jerzy Jedlicki, who was a Pole, identified as a Pole, but was also Jewish and a Holocaust survivor. And in the 1980s, he was involved with illegal conspiratorial education circles, and was interned in a camp for a while. And I remember asking him basically the same question, and what he said was, and so this is a guy, by the way, who was on the far left. He was very much a social democrat. Like he was voting for the farthest, like not the Communist Party, but he was voting for the labor union party as soon as he could. As soon as he could vote, for a social democratic party, he did. But he said essentially something very similar. He said, "They're not following me anymore. They're not. I'm not worried who's denouncing me anymore. I can just go through the paces of my life and be me, and not worry that people are denouncing me, that I'm being followed, that somebody's installing something. And that's exactly it. And it comes back to positive freedom, right? Because like the problem isn't some kind of abstract barrier wall, barbed wire. I mean, in the end, that wall is always there, like in Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the everyday problem. The everyday problem is that, like you say, you can't pursue the things that make you different and special and interesting. You can't leave a mark in the world. You can't impress other people. You just become this incredibly tedious version of yourself. This incredibly predictable version of yourself, as Václav Havel said. And that's, so it's not, oppression isn't just like, it's not like quantitative, you can measure it if you want. Freedom House does, but like it's also qualitative. It's suppressing the qualities that make us the kinds of people we could be.
I think that's so on point, because it is an argument that I think, again, because we haven't done it in this country, there is a psychological appeal to the shortcut of, okay, we're going to do this authoritarian approach, and it's going to be something that people find efficient and effective and gets the job done and gets us to the point we want to be at, and they don't realize that what the sacrifices are. You talked a little bit in the book and about this idea that freedom requires a certain care with how we approach things like economics and things like how we speak in the public space and how we think about the impact of these things. One of the things I've always been curious about, and I've asked a lot of Republicans this, I've asked a lot of academics this question, I've asked because I don't know the real answer, and even though I was part of that machine, what has made the turn away from what was not perfectly, but at least aspirationally a pro-freedom party in terms of markets, in terms of speech, in terms of personal liberty? What do you think has made the turn among so many of these people in one of our major political parties toward lack of care about how we talk about freedom, lack of care about how we think about individual liberty?
Yeah, that's that's such a wonderful question. Before I get into that, I want to pause on one part of your setup, which is that, like, when we talk about Americans and not having an imagination of this, it kind of depends on which Americans, right?
True.
Because, like,
True.
some people do, and they're the ones who you could kind of count on to vote against Trump, right? For all of the there was a lot of hype about how African Americans were going to vote, but if you look at how they actually voted, like, they're voting as people who actually know what tyranny can look like. And I think that, like, that's something that the rest of us ought to take in, maybe more than we do. Okay, onto the Republicans. I mean, I'm not an insider there, but I'll give you a few thoughts. One is, I think it has to do with taking economic freedom too far. So, like, it's definitely true that having a right to property and being able to have a small business and that kind of stuff can be part of a civil society which creates the space for freedom. Like, any student of communism, is going to probably say something like that. But if you push that too far, like if you push anything too far, if you push it to like an abstract ideology, like government is always bad or the market is always good, then, like, the market then in a way becomes authoritarian, because you're saying, well, it's not up to me, it's up to the market. And a lot of Republicans have moved in that direction. I think actually the whole national conversation has moved in that direction, where we say, well, whatever the market dishes up for us, that must be freedom. But of course, that attitude itself is authoritarian, because you're saying, okay, well, what I'm going to call I'm going to be an everyday Orwellian about this. Whatever the world dishes up for me, I'm going to call that freedom. And so that's part of it, because of course, if you push the market too far, then what you end up with is, market concentration. You end up with these ridiculous, centibillionaires. You end up with too few media outlets. You end up with massive wealth inequality, and massive wealth inequality is unhealthy for Republicans and for everybody else, because it means that the intellectual classes cluster around a few very rich people, and they end up saying the things which the very rich people say, which is not going to end up meaning freedom for everybody else. And then, of course, there's the Cold War, which was bad for, the end of the Cold War, I think, was bad for a lot of Republicans, because the Soviets kept us honest. The Soviets picked on us on civil rights, and they had a point, and they picked on us about economic inequality, and they had a point. And I think that kind of kept Republicans within a certain container, which after the end of the Soviet Union, they could escape from. And then the other thing I just want to say is, I think the internet has been very bad for everybody, but I think it's pushed people who started out being conservatives, because, like, for me, there aren't that many conservatives left, and that's the problem. Like, conservatives, I feel like you can certainly talk to, like, I like talking to conservatives. There are only about 15 of you left, but, like, I like talking to you, but there's a lot to talk about. And, like, conservatives, I think, are correct about a lot of important questions. But I think a lot of folks who might 30 years ago have been conservatives have been pushed by the internet towards much more conspiratorial ways of seeing the world. I think the internet's a big part of it.
I think that's absolutely, because you said in that chapter, and I remembered it, and it as a conservative, as a guy who really believed a lot of that Rothbardian sort of doctrine about markets, the Hayek sort of doctrine about markets. But you said it in the book, and it really struck me. It was like, markets cannot be free; only people can be free. And I think that the illusion of the free market, with a lot of the folks who are aspirationally leaning towards, oh well, if we can just control all the behavior, all of the the noise in our society, then these markets can expand. This like idea of the libertarian dream of completely unfettered markets, it does almost inevitably lead you to authoritarianism. And that's something it took me a long time to think that through. The enabling factor of it leading to authoritarianism is in America that everything is for sale on a legislative basis. So, you see these major players, and Elon Musk, I think, represents sort of the alpha case of that right now, where by spending $200 some million, he's enabled himself to become vastly richer and more powerful. And he didn't have to lobby for it; he just bought it outright. So, I do think that's something that, for me as a conservative, I had to like really grapple with this. Like, free markets are a laudable idea, but you have to look at them as to what they can lead to in a world where authoritarians will exploit the naive beliefs about free markets. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything you just said would just be like, as a transcript, would be a great op-ed, and I really appreciate your saying it. I'm gonna add a couple of things. I mean, I just, first, as you called at the very beginning, I really think we should hold back the word free for humans. And if we do that, like, then the whole conversation seems different. Like, I sincerely don't believe that you can put free in front of anything except humans, because I think we're just so different than everything else. And the very act of saying free market, I think that's an authoritarian act, because you're taking free and you're putting it in front of something else. And the second thing, like operationally in the US context, that really matters a lot, and it's relevant to your question about Republicans, is the libertarian view of free speech, where if you think that money is free, right? Like, if you think corporations are people, or if you think that money is somehow relevant to expression, which in my view it's not at all, then you end up making decisions like the Supreme Court has made, and then you end up in a situation where money literally talks, like in the sense of the cliche. Mm-hmm. So yeah, Musk is an exceptional example, but like, legally, we never should have gotten to a point where anything like this was possible. And it's the libertarian view of free speech which dominates inside the Supreme Court, which is the problem here. And I would say that like free speech, I personally shouldn't even be saying it. What I think there is freedom of speech, and that freedom of speech depends upon creating free individuals. Like, freedom of speech is supposed to be about the weakest of us all, and the right of the weakest of us all to speak truth to power. And that's where you have to start constructively. The libertarian view of freedom of speech ends up being like, a rich person, files suit to make sure that his money can get as much influence as possible. And that's a perverted way of thinking about the freedom of speech. And that's part of what's gotten us where we are.
So talk to me a little bit about, to go back to the more affirmative case for freedom and of freedom. Talk to me a little bit about, and so folks can come out of this interview with a sort of an up note, I think, because I think this book I think there's a lot of fundamental optimism about the strength and the power of freedom for humans. Mm-hmm. Talk to us about why people should feel optimistic about the future of freedom, both broadly and individually.
Yeah, I mean, I can go most of the way there. Like, I don't want people to be optimistic, because like, I don't want people to just see the world, I want them to be engaged in the world. And so, the case I would make is, I guess, more of a hopeful case or a constructive case. I think so, and this is going to be a conservative point. I think there really are good things in the world. I think there are virtues in the world. I think that dignity is important, and integrity is important, and honesty is important, and beauty is important. I think all of these things, all these virtues, are real. They're not real the same way that a street or a tree is real, but they are just as real. And I think like that itself is something which I think has to be asserted, because so much of the authoritarian turn is nihilistic, cynical bullying. So as soon as you say, I care about this, I care about that, then you get mocked, you get bullied, you get cornered, because you're so naive that you care about something. And that's something the Russians perfected, and it's really become important in the US as well, especially on the internet. So then the second level is, okay, that's freedom. So what is freedom? Freedom is, we have the ability, we live in a state where we can realize the things that matter to us. We can try to balance them, figure them out, deal with their contradictions, live our own unique lives. And that's freedom. And that's the best of all possible things. It's the value of values, in my point. And then what's happy about that is that gives you a prescription for government. because we get stuck in this American dispute, like, should we have more or less government? That is not it at all. Like, I don't like, that's not the formula. The formula is, does the government help people to be free? And that should help conservatives, because there are definitely some things which the government can do to make us more free. But it should also help people on the left, because the justification, in my view, for stuff like healthcare or vacations or parental leave, or for that matter, good roads, is freedom. I think that's the best argument for all of those things, that allows us to live more free lives. And so freedom becomes a formula for government doing the right thing. Banging our heads against each other about like whether it's more or less is not helpful. But I think some of us could agree that, hey, freedom is the highest value, or it's the value of values, or it's central, and you can actually get to it with the right kind of government. And this is also helpful for, it's helpful for centrist Democrats, I think, too, because Republicans often have a point that like this or that aspect of government isn't working well, or it's ineffective, or it's, and Democrats can say, okay, you have a point, but you don't then burn it all down. What you do is you evaluate everything in terms of how liberating it is, and you try to make it better the whole time.
Right. And that idea that you can that you can protect and improve freedom, I think, is one that authoritarians want you to not believe in. They want you to think that there are a lot of people on that authoritarian thought process, from the Dugans to the Bannons of the world, who want you to think that the ratchet only moves one way, and it only moves toward the darkness and the authoritarian side. And I think psychologically, authoritarianism has a lot of advantages in a world fueled by the internet. But I'm so grateful that you wrote this book, because I read it over the holiday, and I just thought it was tremendously moving and tremendously important. And I want to thank you so much for coming on the program today to talk about it a little bit, because we only go for half an hour, and I wish we had more time on this show, but I'm just deeply grateful for your work and your observations. Any final thoughts on what you want folks to take away from this book?
No, I love what you just said about from the Dugans to the Bannons, because what unites those kinds of neo-fascists is this idea that, like, it's basically a kind of political vampirism. They're going to draw you underneath their black cloak into the only reality in
right.
which there is no truth and no values. But at least we know there's no truth and no values, and so we can
nothing but power, right?
And everybody else, nothing but power, and that's just so intellectually just a dead end. And I think it's also just an incorrect description of the world. There are lots of good things in the world. There are lots of truths in the world, and it's worth trying to think about how you can push your system in that direction, rather than giving in to this, like, honestly, like, incredibly cheap. It's really just it's an excuse to just give up that sort of politics, and we don't need that excuse. There are good things. Freedom's the best of those things.
Yeah, and I love that you call it the value of values. I think that is such an important point. So, folks, the book is On Freedom by Timothy Snyder. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. It's one of the best books I've read in a very long time, and it really will give you the stakes and the value of protecting liberty and freedom in this world, in this country, and in your life. Thank you again, Timothy Snyder, for joining us today on the Enemies List. We're very grateful, and we hope to talk to you again very soon. Thank you so much.
So glad. Thank you.
Folks, as we're recording this on Wednesday at about 11:30 in the morning, Pete Hegseth is on the brink of being removed as the candidate for Secretary of Defense. Why is it? Well, it's simple. Even Donald Trump has a pain threshold he cannot exceed. Now, the fact that crazy nominees, Matt Gaetz, soon to be Pete Hegseth, most likely also RFK, and increasingly, I think, likely Tulsi Gabbard, these people are not going to make it. They're not going to make it because they're unacceptable. And even in Washington now, you are seeing a stirring among members of the U.S. Senate on the Republican side. They're not going to save us, by the way. They're not going to be the good guys and vote down every one of these idiots. But of the ones that are the craziest, I'm shocked that there's more folks speaking out about it. I think Kash Patel now becomes one of the number one targets to focus on. The reason this rant is important, the reason this Enemies List edition is important, is because the people who were most excited about the Matt Gateses, the Pete Hegseths, the Kash Patels, the RFKs. Those people are going to find themselves in a very, very tough spot emotionally very soon, because they were the people that were going to implement Trump's darkest visions. They were the people that were going to get revenge against Trump's opponents. They were the people that were going to, as we just talked about with our guest, engage in the sado-populism of punishing in a public and disgusting way anybody who was opposed to Donald Trump. Those folks are now in a much darker situation. They're going to have to realize now that they're not going to get all the cake they wanted. They're not going to get all the latitude they wanted. And just as these union guys in Philadelphia that Trump promised he would support the Nippon Steel deal yesterday discovered that he lied, MAGA is about to discover that he lied. He lies all the time. He lies to everybody. He lies when he opens his mouth. He lies the second he wakes up in the morning. Okay? None of this is going to go easy for them. So the people that have been promoting this idea that the Trump administration is going to be this revenge machine are about to lose at least one more battle, and probably more. Who are those people? Well, Elon's certainly one of them, saying that my friend Alex Vindman is going to face the penalty for treason. Fuck you, Elon. Eat a giant sack of dicks. Alex Vindman is a patriot. He has served this country. And the fact that you think that he should be killed because he doesn't support Trump, astounding. And that very little has been made of that. But there is also this entire cohort of the one tier below Fox MAGA media feeding Americans this idea that the purpose of a Trump administration is in part or in measure to punish the enemies of Donald Trump, to punish the people that Donald Trump has found in his path to power. Well, I'm one of those people. And here's the thing. Fuck off. No. We will not bow down. We will not give in. We will not comply in advance. We will not kiss the ring. We will not bend the knee. Ever. It's not going to happen. It's never, ever going to happen. Pull me out feet fucking first if you think that's going to happen. But these people that are promoting this idea, these people that are saying, oh, well, we can raise the pain level. We can punish them so much. We can do the things with government that the Democrats never did, by the way. And yet, Republicans are the masters of projection. So they will weaponize the government. They will attack people. They will go after me. Look, guys, I have been fighting for now a year and a half, a $10 million lawsuit by Mike Flynn against me. Okay? It has cost me hundreds of thousands of dollars of my own money to fight this thing. It's insane. But that's a preview. But the people that think that's an acceptable way to exist, the people that think that's an acceptable way to govern, the people that think that's an acceptable path in America to intimidate, to persecute and prosecute, those people are on the enemies list. They ain't never getting off.